Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well and off to a great semester. I'm saying that purposely because of the conversation that we'll be having today, but I'm Alexandra Miller, your host of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. And I completely had to follow up on our episode on Caribbean students' experiences, just given some of the tremendous feedback I received on social media. As many of you likely know, education is a big part of why I began Strictly Facts in the first place. For Black people, for descendants of the enslaved and formerly colonized people, well, frankly, a lot of people across the world, not just Black people, BIPOC, but those who have lived under xenophobic conditions, under hierarchies of race, class, gender, color. We could continue the list and be here forever, but to generally just name a few, education, I think, in my view and in many views, is really the key to our liberation, particularly for the enslaved Africans and their descendants, of which I am one. And so, not too long ago, Black people weren't even legally allowed to learn to read and many things like that. And that's not just in the Caribbean, but many places across the world. And so it is precisely for this reason why I had to have this conversation on the history of education in the British West Indies and take our conversation a little bit across the waters too, right? To the UK, where fellow podcaster and PhD student Deanna Lyncook is joining me today. And really sharing her research to compare the educational experiences of Caribbean youth in both the Caribbean and England. So, Deanna, thank you so much for joining me. I am so grateful to have you on the show and sharing your expertise with us, of course. Why don't we start with you telling us a bit about yourself, your connection to the Caribbean and what inspired your passion for this history of education in the British Caribbean and, British Empire largely.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Deanna Lyncook, as Alexandria said. Thank you so much for having me today. I really like talking. I also have a podcast called The History Hotline, and it's a great outlet for work that I do academically, doing a PhD, and I kind of use it as a space, sometimes a space to rant, sometimes a space to have really well put together conversations and just to, as you kind of have said, share these histories that we really don't get to learn about, I think, within our education system, especially in the UK. I focus mostly on the podcast on Black, British, and Caribbean history. So that looks a lot at migration, and that's kind of one of the biggest themes that I look at. I did my master's and I studied the migration of Caribbean women moving from the Caribbean to Britain during World War II and also within the armed forces and then within healthcare and within education after the war. And then I kind of carried on the theme of migration for my PhD, and I now look at the migration of children and I look at it through their experiences within the education system, coming from essentially a British colonial education system in the Caribbean and moving then to a British education system in Britain in the late 1950s, early 1960s, where you see Caribbean children moving to join their parents oftentimes in large numbers. And so a lot of education policy in Britain is shifted to deal with this immigrant population, who also is made up of South Asians as well, in kind of big numbers, but not as significant as a Caribbean presence. So they feature, but I don't speak on them as much as I do the Caribbean. And then in the context of the Caribbean, going back to actually look at what experiences those children had in school before arriving in Britain. And in Britain, they're kind of posed to be this problem, essentially. But the question is kind of where have they come from and why is their situation with a very similar system in Britain different? So that's kind of my big PhD question. I'm just starting my second year, so I haven't got all the answers yet, but I'm really enjoying working through the questions.
I always think that is one of the interesting parts of doing a PhD. We don't have all the answers, but we very much so have all the questions while we're figuring it out. So yes, but I am again so grateful to have you on and also really sharing the experiences of Caribbean folk in the UK. I touched on it a bit in my intro. But I really do want to reinforce our conversation in this colonial history, right? So we can really seriously understand how we get to these problems you're talking about in the 20th century and beyond. So first and foremost, formal education for the masses like really didn't begin all that long ago. There's obviously a longer history. I think, oftentimes what is cited is like the 1743 Codrington Grammar School, which started in Barbados. But for many, at the time, that schooling wasn't available for the enslaved, right? Looking back to some of my readings, that some of those early schools were really mostly for, lower class whites who weren't able to send their students or their children rather to England to be educated. And obviously, for the enslaved, they were viewed as property. So, this conversation we have today about education being a human right, that wasn't one that was obviously granted to them as being seen as slaves and less than human. So, there are several ways, I mean, we could even continue this early colonial education. I'm even thinking, missionaries and the impact of religion. But overall, what is your general gist of this colonial period and the development of education in the Caribbean?
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned the Codrington School, the 1743, I think it was, because some historians used to cite that as kind of the start of some kind of formal education system in the Caribbean, and I don't agree with that at all. First of all, I don't think you can have a general date for any kind of formal education system because, first of all, we've got to think about as much as I am calling the Caribbean as the kind of Anglophone Caribbean and grouping them together. These are different countries and different places that all have different kind of trajectories. And one thing that I found very interesting so far in my research is actually depending on the crop and the kind of plantation setup of the country, really did shift kind of the amount of wealth that a country had, its proximity to certain things, whether that be like headquarters of the Anglican Church, which countries in the Leeward Islands, like St. Kitts, Antigua, they benefited a little bit more in that sense. But then islands that were a little bit bigger, like Jamaica, Barbados, and had a more prosperous sugar plantation economy, they had a very different kind of setup with education because they tended to have a few more wealthy white people there essentially that were going to set up these schools and that were going to have a need for these schools. As you said, it was some of the propertied classes and their children that needed education, the ones that they couldn't afford to necessarily send back to Britain to be educated. And obviously, education was very important to everybody except for the enslaved people who weren't allowed to be part of that. And there was a lot of pushback as well, I noticed, from the plantation owners for their enslaved people to be educated. And even when missionaries would come in and say, well, actually, it's part of the process of civilization, we've got to get these savage Africans civilized, that kind of language and rhetoric, us slaveholders were like, no, absolutely not. Those plantation owners that had enslaved people really feared an educated enslaved person. And so, whilst there were small instances of things like evening school, and there was something called noon school, but actually tended to happen in the evening because that was when the work on the farm or on the plantation was done. And so they were afforded really small and very informal bits of education, and they did center on religious instruction and not much else. And this is the kind of trajectory once you get to this point of emancipation and the period of apprenticeship is over, it's still very much this kind of setup of like dribs and drabs where they find some grants and where there's money, whether that be from a philanthropist or a religious institution, most of it being the churches and all the different denominations from the Catholics to the Anglicans to the Moravians to the Baptists. They were all there donating money for education purposes. It was all in dribs and drabs, and rural children in more rural areas suffered because it tended to be in the kind of more built up and easily accessible places that education started. So there's a very layered class and geographical kind of barrier, and there's also a gendered barrier as well. This is a Victorian era. Girls are reared to be housewives, to be in the domestic space, and even if they are going to work, it's going to be in the domestic sphere, and the boys for agricultural work. And so there's class layers, there's gender layers, there's geographical layers that really don't mean that no one has kind of a similar educational experience in any of the islands or countries in the Caribbean.
And I think even just to add on to this point of the influence of religion at this time, right? And so we see these missionaries pushing forward to, try to educate the enslaved in terms of trying to spread their religious doctrine, right? I can see the argument for being like, they were helping to support, enslaved Africans being educated. There was also still a fundamental layer of hierarchy there, right? Because then it's, instilling this sort of religious conversion tactic where, whatever the belief systems are that were brought from Africa in a sense, Western Africa, obviously, for the most part, become then, there's a hierarchy to them, right? And that's why today we see some of these just belief systems and really, I think, lack of awareness and knowledge of our connections to Africa in many senses, that could probably definitely take us down a very long path. But I did want to uphold that. So I think shifting a little bit to emancipation, I think many are familiar with the fact that in 1834, the Emancipation Act brought an end to slavery. But what some might not be as familiar with is the fact that it also created this formal system of education across the British Caribbean that we see remnants of today, in a sense, right? And so what were deemed the Negro Education Grant was, cemented during this time. And I found this really interesting, just, based off being from Jamaica and being familiar with some of the landscape of our schools here. Um, the inheritance of certain schools was, through this Negro Education Act. And so funny story. I'll give a little segue just so our listeners have a brief little background on this. But the inheritance that helped fund this Negro Education Act was from Lady Jane Mico, who um, initially promised this inheritance of her money and, riches, etc., to her nephew under the condition that he marry his cousin, I believe the story was. And he doesn't ultimately marry his cousin. And so thus the condition then for her money was to then be, and I quote, used to the redemption of Christians captured and enslaved by Barbary pirates. And so for those particularly in Jamaica who are familiar with like Michael College, for example, that is where that money stems from. And so we see this growth of schools being developed really during this time for Black people. I think, obviously we again see the religious connotations there based off the Michael Land Grant. But in your view, what was the shift like in terms of looking at the pre to post emancipation period?
I went to the archives, the National Archives in Jamaica, this summer, and I think I was going through these like meeting minutes, and it's really like silly to say, I think. I don't know if I'm explaining this in the best way possible, but it felt like there's like no real conversation about enslaved people being educated. And then there's like this moment, and they I can't remember the acts are called, I think the amelioration laws or acts, and they come in just before emancipation, and this Emancipation Act is passed because they kind of realize actually if emancipation becomes a thing, which is looking very likely, we have this whole population of uneducated, and I quote, uneducated Negroes. So they need to do something about it. And so they start bringing in these like really small, kind of piecemeal offerings of education, and they're smattered across the place. And as I said, they kind of focus more on religious instruction and very basic literacy, so that these people that are now going to be employed in the kind of same way that they were before, just that enslavement isn't legal anymore. But I don't know if we could, what we can call the next phase of it, really. It didn't change much. They were still working the land most of the time for the owners that they had before. Um, and so this is a little shift where they kind of start booking up their ideas. And then as time goes on and we get to the late 19th century, so like the 1890s, some of the islands that have the funds to do so start putting it into education, and they start in things like creating the buildings that are going to have these schools. And then they start thinking about like very basic curriculum, and it is literally the three R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction. And as time goes on, they start adding things in like history and English. But I think primarily they know it's not going to educate everyone, and they know not everybody, even if they are educated, is going to be able to do anything with that education, because they all need to go and work the land anyway, because these islands are set up, these colonies are still set up to be very heavy on agriculture. So there's this kind of moment where nobody really explicitly cares about them having an education for any kind of social mobility, which I think is a narrative as we get into the 20th century. A lot of people then benefit from things like scholarships to go to the University of the West Indies once it's been established, and to go to Oxford and Cambridge, and to leave the islands. These conversations come a lot later. And at the start, I think it's very clear from those meeting minutes I was going through that, well, actually, we're just doing this because we have to, and because it looks good, and because globally, in a global picture, education and formal education for the masses, when we get into this like early 20th century, is becoming a thing. It's conversations are happening in the Western world and otherwise. And so I don't know, it's kind of like the colonies are like mini Englands, and England is having similar conversations, because the working class aren't educated at all in that way. There's no compulsory education until 1940 with the Butler Act. So it's kind of really, really slow progress, and they don't have the funds for it. And also on the flip side of all of that is, and I one thing I don't think I'd read too much before, is that the formerly enslaved people, and the parents especially, where they have managed to kind of earn a little bit to have their own little piece of land, or a farm, or live in a rural area, they actually need the children at home to work. They can't afford for their children to be in school all day. So again, this class issue where not everybody, even if they can physically access education, economically cannot afford. They have to send their children to school with lunch. They don't have the facilities to do that. Really little things. Even one of the cases I was looking at, they had a problem with punctuality, because a lot of families didn't have clocks, because they ran on the kind of timings of a farm, of, the chicken wakes you up in the morning and you do XYZ jobs, and so on and so forth. And teachers were in a similar position. So there were a lot of issues, I think, with education, and there could never have been a blanket education policy that early on. I don't see how they would have done it another way, but there just wasn't the money for it either. And there wasn't really a concerted effort to kind of get people to buy into education as well, and to see its importance until a little bit later.
Definitely, I agree. I think, while the conversations were being had, there wasn't the preparation for it, despite there really, I think people definitely did see the value though, right? While it may not have been to the same extent that we see it today, right? I think one of the pieces I was looking at prior to, I think it was like in the 1820s, I believe. The article actually said that there were three schools for Black people in Jamaica. And at some point, not too long after emancipation, there were somewhat like over 100, right? And so we see the demand being there, especially as we start to like move further and further away from the plantation economy. But as you said, right, the 20th century, I think in both of our views was really that peak moment where it's not just demand or seen as like getting the basic reading, writing, arithmetic, but it becomes something that's necessary as the standards of, industrialization and growth start to really make change in the Caribbean and the larger world, of course.
I do think, and I think you raise an important question in, did everyone see the value of education? I'm not sure where I fall for the answer. I think you kind of said or suggested that you did, but I do think that the education that was being provided, especially in the early 20th century, was just so much kind of raising these children to be exactly what they would do anyway. Even if they didn't have an education, that is work the land, or work in the domestic sphere, or work in a kind of serving capacity. I'm not sure how much the value was seen in all classes of society. I think definitely for middle class people, it was obvious, this was your chance at social mobility. This was a chance to continue the wealth that had been built in a family so far and to get further education, especially when you start seeing universities in the region popping up and there's opportunities to leave the country. And you see this kind of kind of intellectuals that move in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, sorry. To Britain, you've got the likes of like CLR James, and you've got Marcus Garvey, who's gone well before that, and some of these people. So there is clearly like a tradition of students moving. I think there's a book written by Lloyd Braithwaite called Colonial West Indian Students in Britain, and it looks at their interactions and the kind of struggles that they have. And it's kind of also the inspiration for my PhD, because he'd looked at students, so obviously children, adults at kind of 18 or 19, moving over to Britain. But when you move as a student, you move with agency, you move because you want to. When you move as a child, you don't have a choice. So I say all that to say, I am thinking in my PhD and in my work about this question of, did everyone see the value of education? I think the way we see education now, as in like, my nan literally told me to get as many degrees as humanly possible. Like, it's definitely, I think, something that we value, especially when we move as Caribbean people and we migrate to Britain and the US and Canada. It's something really important because the educational opportunities here are so much better than back home. But I am toying with the question of how much I think that to be true for like the early 20th century.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. I don't know necessarily where I would fall on the spectrum, but I definitely do think, seeing the increase of like, to your point, or your earlier point rather, initially it was kind of like grammar schools, evening schools, etc., right? But then we start to see the growth of like high schools, moving into the 20th century, we see colleges and universities, right? And so schools like Calabar come up during this post-emancipation period, the College of Tropical Agriculture in Trinidad, and then obviously UE, which at the time was the University College of the West Indies, is founded in 1948 with the premise of, and this is a quote, to cultivate the skills, dispositions, and social identities consistent with the imperatives of a nationalistic ethic, right? And so I think while maybe, I would definitely would fall on your point probably like during the 19th century, right? I do think the trajectory starts to shift, especially in the 20th century, as we're seeing these nationalist movements really spark up across not just the Caribbean, particularly, but across the world. I think from here, I definitely want to talk about England. It's a place I've never been to yet. And so in your, shifting to that aim, what occurred, for this massive generation of migrants, especially thinking along the lines with Windrush, and several other things that are happening in this like post-war period. But, as we know, there's a massive growth of Caribbean migrants moving to England, and probably less so considering what education looked like for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Windrush it's a little bit of a contentious term at the moment in Britain. As we think about it being literally a ship that arrived in 1948 in June, at Tilbury Docks, which is in Essex, London, near London, just outside. And it carried, I think it was 1,000 passengers. I think the majority of them were from the Caribbean, and then the majority of them were from Jamaica. And the majority of them were ex-servicemen. So unfortunately, there's been this kind of really real hyper focus on the Windrush and that arrival in particular, because there is actually footage from it. There were interviews done with people on board the ship, and that's kind of helped with public imagination and the public memory of this event and this moment. But I find that it fails to, because you're focusing so much on these ex-servicemen, you forget the fact that there's women there, and women that were unaccompanied as well, women that had been in the auxiliary territorial service during World War II, who are also returning to Britain because they've enjoyed their experiences, they have professional experiences, and they want to continue to work. And also, there's obviously a conversation about children. Now, there really weren't that many children in the early days of migration. So we're talking about the late 1940s into the early 1950s. But immigration acts do change over time. And 1948 is where the Nationality Act is passed, which means that if you are, living in a British colony, you are in fact a British citizen, and there is free movement of people for British citizens across the colonies and to Britain. So this is opens the doors for all of these people to arrive, and it's where my grandparents arrived.
I was just gonna say, or so they say, right? As we know, as history tells, but that's another story.
Air quotes for that one. Yeah, exactly. So, and we could get into that immigration scandal and the deportations and the rest of it, I'm sure another time or today, we'll see. But yeah, so following immigration acts that begin to restrict who can come to Britain. And essentially, there's an act in 1962 that begins to kind of suggest that, the children that are left behind, and a lot of parents did leave their children behind. They have been kind of dubbed barrel children. There's a documentary that's come out in the UK about that and interviewing some of those children that had that experience. These children start coming over to meet their parents. They come with elder relatives that have also been left behind potentially, or aunties, and they arrive in Britain. And this kind of floods the education system, especially in areas where there is high levels of migration, those being the big cities like London, especially in southeast London, areas like Brixton, Peckham, in Birmingham, areas like Handsworth, in Leeds, areas like Chapeltown, and these like little kind of hubs, especially because when you migrate to people that look like you, and you can buy your food, and you're not going to have too many problems assimilating. And there are other people that migrate to more rural areas, and I hope to be able to actually speak to that experience in my work, because migrating to a place that already has a Caribbean community is a very different experience to migrating to a place where you are the Black family. And the experiences are obviously completely different. So you start seeing these children, immigrant children, in schools, and as kind of education policy shifts in the UK from the 1950s, there's this idea where, these children are here, let's kind of have them be part of this culture, and kind of learn what they need to learn to be British. And then they're kind of portrayed as more of a problem, like a social ill that needs to be fixed in a way. And so the policies really start to kind of ramp up. And I haven't looked too much into Britain. I'm not at that stage in my research yet. But I know that there's kind of like three phases: 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s. And by the time you get to the 80s, you have a generation of kind of disconnected, disillusioned Black young people who kind of make up a lot of the people that are part of the riots in 1981, the Brixton riots, Handsworth riots in Leeds. So that's kind of like a whistle-stop tour of migration, but there's a real difference in the generations that arrived. Those that arrived as ex-service people in the kind of early 50s, late 40s, and then their children who come with them, and also the children that are then born in the UK that have this claim to being British. They're literally born in Britain. And whilst they have Caribbean roots, see themselves as British and believe they should be afforded the same rights as any white British person. And this is where you kind of start to see tensions in Britain. For the most part, tensions are still there today.
It's interesting. A while ago, you alluded to several, I think iconic activists and intellectuals from the region who were educated abroad. And, we could even expand that list out if we looked at, you know, some of the first prime ministers and things to that nature. But I don't have the quote on me right now, but I remember reading a piece by Stuart Hall in which he is talking about his education in England and the fact that, upon like learning Caribbean history really in his educational experience, it felt like foreign to him, I think is more or less how that quote went. And I always found that ironic in a sense, just because it's, he was born in Jamaica. For those who aren't familiar, Stuart Hall, amazing cultural studies, Caribbean, transnational intellectual. But, in this piece was really talking about the fact that his education, in a sense, on where is home to him, in a sense, felt like it was new and foreign, really, not only, as a British subject and then having this Caribbean education system that was, founded within the British system, but there are just ways that what was being taught was not of who we actually are as well, right? And so I guess in asking that, what are some of the major challenges that Caribbean youth being educated in the UK faced, and how has this changed over time?
I did look for that quote because that's Stuart Hall, because I use it
Great
all the
minds.
time. Honestly, it says, when I first got to England in 1951, I looked out and there were Wordsworth's daffodils. Of course, what else would you expect to find? That's all I knew about. That is what trees and flowers meant. I didn't know the names of the flowers I had left behind in Jamaica. And I read that quote when I studied Stuart Hall in my undergrad. And I remembered so vividly a conversation I had with my granddad, who essentially mirrored a similar thing, but instead of Wordsworth's daffodils, it was Shakespeare. My granddad could quote Shakespeare until he'd passed away in his 80s. You know, he could recite the Bible because of his schooling in Jamaica and moving to Britain, then essentially knowing more than the native, quote unquote, native British people did, because, you know, they were so familiar with Britain as their mother country, as, you know, London being the heart of empire, and they had such big aspirations to be there. So, yeah, something that I like to pick apart. But challenges to the young people when they arrive in Britain, for the most part, there are literally so many policies that are setting them up for failure, essentially, because at the end of the day, the system was not made for Black children to succeed. And I think we have to remember that I see as the Black children that did succeed, and you can define success how you want, but let's say academically in this context, it was because they are an exception and not because the system was working in their favor. And I'll talk about a few of the policies that were in place. So one of the policies was called busing, and it was this idea that you couldn't have too many Black children or immigrant children, and this also includes a lot of South Asian children as well, in the same school, because they won't assimilate into British culture. And the policy at the time was assimilation. So they did a policy called busing. They bus them out to different schools in quotas so that you'd only have a certain amount of children in each school. I feel like there was a similar policy in the US at some point too. It's
Yes,
ringing a bell.
there.
Yep.
Yes.
Same tactics, same game, just a different day.
Right.
Um, and there was other policies called banding. They would, do IQ tests on these children when they arrived to kind of figure out what year they were going to go into, for example, or what set. But the IQ tests were basically like British culture tests, and they would score them down. And one of the examples I heard, which was it just made me so infuriated, was like they had a picture of like a tap, and they had to label what it was. But they would say a pipe because back home it's a pipe. They know what it is, they know water comes from it, but that would be wrong. And there were so many instances of that. So then they were basically labeled as stupid. Like you have no brains, you can't be in mainstream school. And then you have this thing called an educationally subnormal school. And there were numerous children, disproportionate numbers, Black children that were getting sent to these schools. And this is where Bernard Cord comes in with his book, how the West Indian child is made educationally subnormal in British schools. I don't know why I couldn't think of a shorter title. Always takes up my word count. But essentially he has to do this work, and he doesn't really want to. He's working in a school, and he's kind of seeing these things happen to the children, and I think he's at a meeting where he's kind of explaining it to some people around him, and they're like, you need to write about this, like the parents need to know. And so the kind of Caribbean activist groups at the time, like Sequa and the Black Parents movements, and they're all working together to try and get this information out. And he puts it out as a pamphlet and has a lot of information sessions. And New Beacon Books, who was founded by John LaRose, published it. And it's all this kind of like, I think all the cool historical Black people, they're all working together to really like crack on with this. And this is where we kind of think about, did everyone see the value of education? Well, in Britain, absolutely they did. They fought so hard to secure a good education. And when all this failed, and these children were being failed on institutional levels, they were facing racism in schools from their peers, from their teachers. Expectations were so low, but their ambitions are so high. They started opening supplementary schools. So whenever I think and talk about these challenges that young people faced, I feel like we have to talk about the resistance and the work that parents did and the Black community in these places and spaces to make sure, or try and kind of counteract the education that they're having. And supplementary schools go all around the country, and they're kind of still around today, some of them not in maybe the kind of original forms, teaching Black history or supplementing maths and English because they knew that to be important. Some of them do different things today, but it's a kind of a fibre of Black British life, because you couldn't rely on the education system to teach what it needed to for your child to succeed. And that was the whole point of them coming, you know?
I mean, as you were talking, I was even brought back to a conversation I've had with my mom, who, upon migrating to the US in the 70s, they tried to put her in ESOL or, they tried to hold her back in some way in her academic journey based off her not speaking English to their liking, right? And I'm like, the
Yep.
accent is the accent is the accent, but whether my mom spoke English or not is not the question. And so these, I think, are just ways that migration has affected us,
Hmm.
colonialization has affected us, and really, I think, harken to the story of the Caribbean diaspora in a really
Yeah.
important way. I would love to hear more about, some of the activism that occurred. Of course, think of like Beryl Gilroy, from British Guyana, who was one of the, or I think the first, um,
One of, yeah.
one of the first black head teachers in the UK. And so I believe there was like a Black parents movement, etc. And so what have been some of the major takeaways in, I know, this very early stage of the research that we're looking forward to hearing more about?
Well, yeah, so supplementary schools are really big. They take place normally on Saturdays or in the evening. And it's kind of interesting, I think, because these parents didn't necessarily take their children out of mainstream schooling, they did extra schooling. And I don't know if that's because there was some hope that actually it would work and education would benefit their children in some way. And also, obviously, the demands of work and life in Britain, where you're having to work several jobs and night shifts and day shifts to cover rent and all that kind of thing. And obviously, parents are also facing state racism in housing and employment. On the street, there's racism. It's a very, really difficult time. And for us in Britain, anyway, the Race Relations Act doesn't come until 1965. So there's absolutely no legal requirement that means people have to be non-racist to you. They can do exactly what they want when it comes to racism. And so, and even in 1965 doesn't really change much. It's only when the law kind of develops to extend to employment and housing and things like that where you kind of start to see a little bit of a shift. But a lot of the activism comes from groups of parents primarily, and community activists. There is Eric and Jessica Huntley, who owned Bogle Overture Publications, and they were working to publish books because one of the issues was that Black children couldn't see themselves in anything that they had to read, anything prescribed to them. And Beryl Gilroy as well, she was an author that wrote a lot of children's books to really bring up the self confidence and to bring up the perception of self for Black children. So there's all of kind of these kinds of things happening with publications. And there's also, as I've mentioned, John LaRose and New Beacon Books, and the work that they're doing as well in publishing. And there's the Black Parents Movement, there's the Black Education Movement. There is TAR, Teachers Against Racism, and the work they're doing. So you've got kind of different levels. You've got parents obviously looking out for their children and the children in the community. You've got teachers, and it's not always just Black teachers. They are in really small numbers. But there are white teachers and Asian teachers that are genuinely against racism and can see some of the issues that are taking place and trying to, make a difference. Race Today is a publication that kind of comes out or is affiliated with a lot of the British Black Panther movement and the people that were associated with that, Farouk Dondi, Darcus Howe. And so within that as well, a lot of the kind of stories and issues within the education system are coming out in that publication. That's something I lean on a lot for my work. And you've got all of these kind of people moving in different places. I call them all kind of like the stakeholders of education, all moving at different mediums to try and kind of make the education experiences a little bit better for Black children. And it's a difficult one, because a lot of the time they're not used to the racism, and I think it takes them a little bit longer than is helpful to kind of clock onto it, because there's so much trust. The way education is done in the Caribbean, there is so much trust that these teachers just want your children to do the best and to succeed. If there is a child in the Caribbean, for example, that's really bright, is doing really well, they'll be pushed. In England, there's a Black child that's doing well and really bright. They'll be like, calm down, relax. Don't be too ambitious. Kids like you don't do that. My mom was told at school, like, don't bother applying to university. Like, girls like you become typists and secretaries. Absolutely nothing wrong with being a typist, but no, like, absolutely not. Um, And this is in like the 70s and 80s. So this, you can imagine what it was like in the 50s and early 60s. So there's just all of these issues kind of going on, and everyone's trying to work at it. But also, I don't think a lot of the parents knew how bad things were. A lot of them have commented in interviews since, like, we didn't know what education system normal meant. We thought it was a special school, special because they were special in a positive way, not special in a negative way. So there are all these kind of tricks of language and just a lack of understanding of the system in Britain. And also they're dealing with everything else. They're dealing with housing. I've said they're dealing with employment. They're dealing with their other children, older children, husbands, family problems that everybody has generally. And it's just, I think it's a really tough time for them to figure out what's going on and then to act on it.
And in some ways, these things haven't fully ended, right? Um, I think back to my high school experience and having a white guidance counselor tell me that I should apply to lesser known schools or whatever. I know what he meant by that, or lesser ranked schools is what he said. Well, here we are now.
Yeah,
Done
exactly.
quite well for myself, I think so. Um,
PhDs on the way. Yeah,
but
exactly.
I do think, though, in a sense, both of our podcasts are really continuing some of this work, right? Thinking of what the supplementary schools were doing. And while, depending on where we are in the world, it looks a little bit differently, the importance of not just education for education's sake, right? It's not just merely learning your times tables or whatever, right? But there is empowerment, there's self progress, there's development in knowing who we are, especially as the children of the enslaved. And so I think that just, I know you touched on it a bit in your introduction talking about the history hotline, but I did definitely want to give you a space to talk about what inspired you to start your show.
Oh, thank you. I think maybe similarly to you from episodes I've listened to your podcast as well, and I do love it, by the way. I've been very much enjoying myself. Um, I think that it was 2020 when I started, and I was doing my master's, and it was a pandemic. It was lockdown. I was just in my room doing my master's research every single day, and it was a bit draining, to say the least, because my usual two other friends that I did my master's with, they didn't do history, they did other things, but every day I just tell them everything I was learning and writing about, and they weren't there anymore because everybody was locked down. And I think I was kind of boring my family a little bit with all my history stories. And I knew I had all this knowledge, like I'd been doing history for a while at that point, and I figured a lot of the kind of Instagram pages and on social media that I'd followed before the murder of George Floyd, and that lit up the world a little bit, they were kind of all getting a lot of attention. And it was like there was actually, for once, it seemed this actual desire to learn more about Black Britain. In Britain, we have this issue, and it's Black History Month here now. And every time it's Black History Month, without fail, we will always, someone will always call out like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. And no offense, they are obviously incredible people, very inspiring people to the US civil rights movement and movements for racial equality in America. But we have so many people in Britain that did incredible work that we can see the tangible change in our society because of the work they did. Yet every time we go to America. So I figured actually, it's not people's fault that they weren't taught this at school. But I know this stuff, so I'm going to share it. And that's why I started essentially. And it's kind of grown. It's been 3 years now. And I just don't think I'm ever going to run out of episodes because every time I research something more, there's like another 5 avenues of things you can talk about and tell people about, and the audience is there for it. And I've been really thankful for that actually, because sometimes I just think I like history, but I'm a bit of a nerd. So does anybody else actually like it?
Why are
Right?
we twins? We are the same. I'm usually like, I know I enjoy this, but I don't, I'm like, but yes, I
You
very
get
much
excited
so.
as well. You read something and you're like, oh my God, this is it. I found it. And like
Yeah,
nobody
for
else is.
sure.
Yeah, no, I'll be messaging you now. Like, it's my interesting fact of the day.
I totally echo those sentiments. And especially just like, I think the way that academia has been set up for me, it was also just the fact that while I very much so recognize my privilege in being able to, get this information in some degree, right? Whether that's through my classes or through the libraries that our schools have, or, whatever it is, the internet even, right? This is largely information that not everybody has. And I think podcasting is a great way to share it. So,
Absolutely. And it's accessible because some of
yes.
these academic journals, like who's reading that? You
Also,
know?
who's paying for the
Right.
right?
Right. Exactly.
Anywho,
Yeah.
another
Another episode.
topic for another time. um, well, I think I would be remiss without really ending on this point, and it's the fact that, while part of our conversation today obviously focused on a time when the Caribbean was colonized, and of course, some parts of the Caribbean are still colonized today, we have obviously made tremendous strides in terms of gaining independence, moving towards republics, being republics as many of us are today. I even think of the fact that there are certain schools, my sister just graduated from Hampton, so big up Senti anyway with it. But Hampton and several others were founded actually pre, emancipation. Not all of the high schools necessarily, but some of them
Mm.
were. And so, to be Black people now going to some of the schools that were founded without us in mind, right, is already a stride. But I just wanted to ask you, as you're continuing your research, what are your hopes for the future of education for Caribbean people, be that, in the region, in the UK, and across the rest of the world?
It's a big question. I think that unfortunately, for me, it seems anyway, and this is definitely from the perspective of an outsider looking in, and I always kind of preface with that because I think being of the Caribbean diaspora, not being born or raised in the Caribbean, and um, the way that I see Jamaica, especially being where my family are from, I don't have the answers, if that makes sense. And there's only so much I can say looking at it from over here in the United Kingdom, where the SELP is a lot different, and we are essentially profiting off the wealth of the colonies in a really weird, backwards, roundabout way, even being in Britain now. But I will say that the kind of conversations I have with like friends back in Jamaica when I talk to them is that like, they have their education there and they might go to UE and then the jobs aren't there. And there's a brain drain. We know there's a brain drain in the Caribbean, but I just need these governments to do more for these young people because they have so much talent. There's so much resilience. There's so much skill. Like I saw the other day. This is a bit of a tangent. Sorry, but there was this Jamaican boy. He's just graduated as a doctor in China, and he was valedictorian,
I
and he
did
did
see that.
the whole speech in Mandarin.
I saw
Oh,
that.
isn't that great? Like, what? Incredible. There's a small island of what, 3 million people, if that yet, to be having influence all over the world across so many different spheres of influence and discipline and profession. It's incredible. Um, I need these governments to do more, but I need this government in the United Kingdom to do more so they can do more because this conversation about reparations needs to become less of a conversation and more check writing and money giving because this is just ridiculous. Like you can't expect countries to prosper, should I say, even though we are prospering in other ways, without these funds when so much has been stolen by way of free labor, natural resources, culture, language, religion, the list goes on. So there's kind of like a lot of different issues here. By way of, I just think it's really sad that a lot of young people in Jamaica, especially, just want to leave. They want better opportunities, and that looks like going to America, Canada, or Britain. And those opportunities aren't always viable. They're not there for everybody. Not everybody can afford to send their child to a good university somewhere else. And so it's kind of sad, I think, for me, because I think there's so much potential, and not a lot of opportunity for that potential. So I want to see reparations so that that can change. I'm not a politician. I don't have all the answers, but there are people out there that do have answers. So Hilary Beckles is one of them. And he talks a good talk, and I agree with 99% of things he says. So forward to him for that one.
Definitely Hillary Beckles, Verena Shepherd, so
Yeah,
many, I think,
right.
who are pioneering this reparations talk. But also, to your point, right? Not only does that mean that some of the best and brightest are leaving Jamaica to go pursue opportunities elsewhere, and
Yeah.
this also applies to other parts of the region. Um, But then the greatness that we could have is, I think that's also
Yeah.
the other part of the brain drain conversation, right? It's not just, oh, people are leaving and, seeking a better life elsewhere. I
Mm.
don't, of course, don't fault them for that. That is how I ended up being born in the US, because that's what my family did, of course, right? But there is a reinvestment that is lost, right?
Yeah.
The things that, we will take and do because we are Talawa people
Hmm.
are then, it's placed in the US or in England or in Canada. And while that's not necessarily a problem, I would love that investment to go back to home. So nonetheless, favorite question of all, last question. I mean, I was thinking about this prior to us recording, and I was like, wow, I could say a lot of different ways I see education, and this history of education showing up in popular culture. So what are some of your favorites?
I had two. I got a British example and a Caribbean example. So the British example was within, I don't know if you saw or heard of the Small Axe series that was directed by Steve McQueen, and there was an episode that touched on education. And since then, we've had actually documentaries on education in subnormal schools and interviews about this process. And actually, there's a court case of some Black children that are now actually 60s or 70s taking I think the education system to court over the mislabeling of that term and that kind of thing. So just seeing that kind of trajectory from it being popularized in this drama to then documentaries about it, which is obviously real life, to this court case, to see that kind of shift from something in popular culture to literally actually holding people account. I've enjoyed that. And then I just finished Here Comes the Sun by Nicole Dennis Ben.
Great
Um,
book.
I have no words for it, but I think I liked the portrayal of Tandy's character, who's younger sister, and I won't do any spoilers. But some of the things I was talking about in my last answer about this idea of education and then leaving kind of with that education that you've got. And I think the family's hopes for her as this daughter, they put so much money and energy and time into the fact that so she never has to do anything but just get the good grades, become a doctor and save everybody. I think the pressure that education system has on her and her family's pressure and kind of the hopes of the whole even area are on her shoulders because everyone's willing her to just do well because your mom and your sister are working so hard. So that was kind of another way I was thinking about education as well in that. And I guess that's my Caribbean example.
Definitely. I don't know if this was the documentary you were thinking about, but were you thinking of Subnormal?
Yes, subnormal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, great documentary on, the British education system and its challenges. And that's me putting it very tersely, but particularly for Caribbean folk. I also want to uplift Mighty Sparrow's education, or I think it's called Education is a Must. I've talked about it before on the podcast, but I think it's just a really great calypso song. Understanding that not only is he, obviously articulating that education is a must and is a key to success, but I think the song is at a time where, it is around that decolonization moment. I don't remember any necessarily like racial connotations for it, right? I definitely do see them in there if they're not in there explicitly, just discussing how education is a must, especially for these new growing nations and the fact that our islands are taking shape in a different way.
Yeah.
So, with that, the conversation is not necessarily over, and I'm sure Deanna and I will continue to have many because this was really fun. But I will be taking our conversation a little bit in a different direction in our episode to come, focusing on the Dominican Republic. So don't go anywhere. Strictly Facts is always available on all social media platforms at Strictly Facts Pod. And new episodes every other Wednesday. So be sure to stay tuned in. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Deanna, for sharing with me, and little more, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.